There is a wooden box in a private collection in the American Midwest that almost no one has been allowed to open. Inside it are 41 glass plate negatives, each one wrapped in brown paper that has gone soft with age, each one labelled in a careful hand with a date in the year 1881. The man who made them was a commercial photographer named Silas Brenner, and he spent the last working season of his life climbing to the highest rooftops of a great lakeside city to photograph its skyline. The pictures he took of the streets are ordinary enough. It is what sits in the background of those plates, far behind the subjects he was paid to capture, that has made grown collectors go quiet and refuse to lend them out. Because the city in the background of Silas Brenner's photographs does not match the city the history books say was standing there in 1881. To understand why Silas Brenner matters, you first have to understand what a photographer actually was in the year 1881. He was not an artist in the way we think of one. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Today, he was a tradesman, a technician, a man who hauled a heavy box of mahogany and brass up flights of stairs and across muddy streets so that he could sell proof of things to people who needed proof. A railroad company hired him to document a new depot. A bank hired him to photograph the strength of its stone facade. An insurance assessor paid him to make a record of a warehouse district before a policy was written. Brenner did not photograph the skyline because he found it beautiful. He photographed it because someone was paying him to make a permanent, unarguable record of what stood where, and how tall, and how solid. That is the first thing that makes his plates so difficult to dismiss. A painting can lie. A drawing can exaggerate. A written description can be the product of a tired clerk or an excitable traveller. But a wet collodion glass plate negative is a chemical fossil. The light that struck those buildings on a particular afternoon travelled through Brenner's lens and burned itself into a film of silver. Whatever was in front of the camera is in the plate. There is no brushstroke to question. There is only the question of why the buildings in the plate are not the buildings the records say should have been there. Silas Brenner was born, by the few documents that survive, sometime around 1834. He learned his trade in the years after the daguerreotype gave way to the glass negative, which means he came up in the single most important transition in the history of recorded images. For the first time, a single photograph could be reproduced. A man could make a record and then make 100 copies of that record. To a society obsessed with commerce, with deeds and titles and the documentation of property, this was not a novelty. It was a revolution in accounting. The photograph became a kind of currency of truth. And here we arrive at the strange heart of this story, the part that belongs not to the history of art, but to the history of money. Because what Brenner was photographing again and again in the background of his commissioned work were buildings that no economy of 1881 should have been able to afford. Consider what we are told about the cities of the American interior in that decade. We are told they were young. We are told that most of them had been rough timber settlements only 30 or 40 years earlier. We are told their populations were small, their tax bases thin, their industries still finding their feet. We are told that the men who lived there were practical, frugal, and overwhelmingly poor by our standards, that they worked from sunrise to dark, and that the great wealth of the age was concentrated in a handful of railroad and steel and oil fortunes on the eastern seaboard. Now look at what those same cities were apparently building. Look at the courthouses with their domes of cut granite that would bankrupt a modern county to construct. Look at the train stations the size of cathedrals with vaulted ceilings of iron and glass, with stone carving so fine it would take a master mason a year to complete a single column. Look at the exhibition halls, the opera houses, the customs buildings, the post offices raised in the middle of muddy frontier towns, structures so vast and so ornamented that we could not build their equal today, even with cranes and power tools, and a budget without limit. The official explanation for this is straightforward, and most people accept it without a second thought. The buildings were monuments to civic pride. Immigrant labour was cheap, stone was local, ambition was high. A young and confident republic wanted to announce itself to the world, and so it built grandly beyond its means on credit and optimism. But Silas Brenner's plates raise a quieter and far more troubling possibility. What if some of those buildings were not built by the people who claimed them? What if the men of 1881 did not raise those structures at all, but simply moved into them, the way a later tenant moves into a house whose foundation he did not pour? This is the idea that has come to be called the reset. It is not a single theory, but a family of suspicions, and at its centre is one simple observation. The physical grandeur of the 19th century does not match the economic story we are told about the 19th century. The buildings are too large, too fine, too numerous, and too uniform in their style for the populations and the wealth that supposedly produced them. Something, the suspicion goes, came before. An older order, an older infrastructure, an older world was inherited rather than created, and the true history of how it came to be empty was quietly written out of the record. Brenner's photographs would be only a curiosity if they simply showed us grand buildings. We have thousands of photographs of grand 19th century buildings. What sets his plates apart is the background, the thing he captured by accident behind and beyond the structures he was paid to document. In at least 11 of the 41 surviving plates, far in the distance beyond the rooflines of the recognized city, there stands a second skyline. It appears as a band of shapes along the horizon, softened by the haze that always hangs over a lakeside city in summer. At first glance, a viewer takes it for more of the same city, more rooftops, more chimneys. But when the plates are examined closely, when the negative is enlarged and the shapes are studied, they do not resolve into ordinary buildings. They are too tall. Their proportions are wrong for the warehouses and tenements that the maps say occupied that ground. Several of them taper toward the top in a way that no recorded structure in that city ever did. And rising above the band in 3 separate plates is the unmistakable outline of a tower that does not appear on any map, any deed, any insurance survey, or any other photograph of that city from that year. Skeptics have an answer for this, and it deserves to be heard. They say the distant shapes are smoke. They say they are clouds. They say they are flaws in the glass, or distortions in a cheaply ground lens, or the ghosts that wet collodion plates were notorious for producing when the chemistry was imperfect. They point out that Brenner was a working tradesman, not a scientist, and that his equipment was old even by the standards of his day. These are reasonable objections, but they run into a problem, and the problem is consistency. A flaw in the glass appears in 1 plate, not 11. A cloud changes shape from one afternoon to the next. Smoke drifts. Yet the distant skyline in Brenner's plates holds its position and its proportions across photographs taken on different days from different rooftops at different times of the afternoon, with the light falling from different angles. The tower is in the same place relative to the lake in every plate that shows it. Whatever it was, it stood still, and it cast a consistent shadow, and a cloud does not do that. There is one more detail, and it is the detail that turns this from a curiosity into something that keeps people awake. In the margins of 3 of the plates, Brenner wrote notes to himself, the way a working photographer often did, reminders about exposure and developing. On the plate that shows the tower most clearly, in the same careful hand that labelled all the others, he wrote 4 words. The old works north. The old works. Not the new construction, not the rising city. The old works, as though there were a body of structures so established, so taken for granted in his own mind, that they needed no further description. As though everyone he knew understood what stood to the north, even as the official record was already busy forgetting it. Who was meant to read that note? Brenner was writing to himself, which means he was not inventing a mystery for an audience. He was recording a fact he considered obvious. And that is the most unsettling thing a researcher can encounter. Not a wild claim shouted at the world, but a quiet, private aside that assumes a reality completely at odds with the one we have been handed. There is more in the plates than the distant horizon, and the foreground reward studied just as much. Look at the streets of the recognized city, the ones Brenner stood above while he worked. They are wide. Absurdly wide for a frontier town that supposedly grew up around the slow traffic of horses and handcarts. They are boulevards built to a scale that would suit a capital of millions, laid out in front of buildings that the records insist housed a population of only a few tens of thousands. Why would a young, cash-starved settlement grade and pave avenues broad enough to turn an army when its own carts could pass 3 abreast and leave room to spare? The official answer is foresight, the ambition of city planners who built for a future that had not yet arrived. The reset researchers see something simpler. The streets were already there, inherited at their full width, and the small population of 1881 simply lived along the edges of roads that had been laid out for a world far larger than their own. And then there is the question that haunts every photograph of the period, the question of where the people are. Brenner photographed his city on working afternoons in the heart of its commercial district, and his streets are nearly empty. A handful of figures, blurred by the long exposure, stand near the buildings. The great boulevards stretch away with almost no one on them. We are told this is an artifact of the camera, that exposures of several seconds erased anyone who moved, leaving only those who stood still. That is a true and reasonable explanation. But it cannot fully account for what the plates show, because a moving person does not vanish entirely from a long exposure. He leaves a ghost, a smear, a faint trail of his passage. Brenner's streets do not have ghosts. They have stillness. They look less like a bustling city caught by a slow shutter, and more like a vast and beautiful stage from which most of the cast has already departed. None of this proves anything on its own. Wide streets can be explained. Empty avenues can be explained, but the explanations accumulate, and at some point the weight of them begins to press on the simple story we were handed. To follow this trail, we have to ask what was actually standing in the cities of the 1870s and 1880s, and here the economic history becomes genuinely strange. Across the country, in city after city, enormous structures were raised for the great expositions and world's fairs of the era. These were not modest pavilions. They were among the largest enclosed spaces ever built by human beings to that time. Halls covering dozens of acres under a single roof, domes that rivaled the great cathedrals of Europe, palaces of glass and iron and plaster, decorated with a richness that photographs can barely convey. And then, we are told, almost all of them were torn down. Built at staggering expense, opened for a single season, admired by millions, and then demolished within a year or two. Their materials scattered, their sites cleared, as though the only purpose of the most magnificent buildings ever constructed was to stand briefly and then vanish. The official reason is that they were temporary by design, made of impermanent materials, never meant to last. But this is precisely where the economic argument grows teeth. Building on that scale costs an immense amount of money and labour, whether the structure is meant to last a year or 1,000. The foundations alone, the engineering, the sheer quantity of material, represent a staggering investment. No rational economy spends that kind of wealth to create something it intends to throw away in 18 months, unless the buildings were never built for the fair at all, unless they already stood, and the fair was the story invented to explain why they were there, and the demolition was the means of removing the evidence once the story had served its purpose. This is the version of events that the reset researchers propose, and Silas Brenner's plates sit directly on the seam of it. To grasp the scale of what we are being asked to believe, it helps to put numbers to the stone. A single ornamental column of the kind that lined those halls, carved with acanthus leaves. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Transported and assembled in the brief window before each fair opened its doors. The records tell us this work was done in a year or two, sometimes less, by a workforce drawn from a city that was simultaneously building its own homes, its own factories, its own railroads, and its own everyday life. The arithmetic strains. There were not enough trained masons in the entire country to carve, in the time allowed, the volume of ornament that these buildings are said to have contained, and certainly not while also building everything else the era is credited with building. The official history closes this gap with the word ingenuity. Mass production, prefabrication, plaster castings pressed from moulds, an army of immigrant labourers working for pennies. All of that is real, and all of it helps. But it does not fully close the gap, and the people who first raised these doubts were not cranks. They were builders and engineers who looked at the documented timelines, looked at the documented workforce, and could not make the two agree. When a thing cannot have been built as quickly as we are told, by as few hands as we are told, for as little money as we are told, the disciplined response is not to invent a miracle. It is to ask whether the thing was built at that time at all. Because the lakeside city where he worked hosted, in the decade after his death, exactly one of these great expositions, the grand halls rose on the northern shore. They opened, they dazzled, and they came down. And the ground they occupied, the ground that was cleared and flattened and built over, was the ground to the north, the same direction Brenner pointed when he wrote The Old Works North 10 years before the fair was ever announced. Think carefully about the sequence. A photographer in 1881 records a skyline of impossibly tall structures to the north of the city and calls them, almost absently, the Old Works. A decade later, on that same northern ground, a temporary city of palaces appears, is celebrated for a season, and is erased. If Brenner saw nothing, if the distant shapes were truly clouds and smoke, then it is a remarkable coincidence that the empty fields he photographed were the very fields chosen for structures that themselves would vanish without a trace. The reset hypothesis does not require us to believe in anything supernatural. It does not need lost technology or vanished races, though some of its more colourful proponents reach for those things. At its most disciplined, it requires only this, that the buildings of the old world were more numerous and more advanced than our economic history admits, that a transition occurred, gradual or sudden, in which an older population and an older order gave way to a newer one, and that the new order, for reasons of legitimacy, found it useful to claim the buildings as its own, and to file the awkward gap in the record under fire, under flood, under demolition, under the general forgetting that swallows everything eventually. We know that cities of that era burned, and burned catastrophically. The great fires of the 19th century are well documented. Entire downtowns reduced to ash in a single night, hundreds of acres levelled, populations displaced. The official histories treat each fire as a tragic accident, a knocked lantern, a dry summer, a careless spark. But the reset researchers notice something in the aftermath. After the fire, the rebuilding is almost always faster than seems possible. A city of stone and iron is reduced to rubble, and within a few short years a new city stands in its place, often grander than before. Where did the labour come from? Where did the money come from in a frontier economy that supposedly had so little to spare? Or did the fire clear away an old layer, and the new buildings were not rebuilt at all, but uncovered, repaired, and reoccupied, with the fire serving as the explanation for the seam between the old world and the new? Silas Brenner did not live to see the great exposition rise on the northern ground he photographed. He died in the winter of 1882, less than a year after the last of his dated plates was made. The cause recorded was pneumonia, an ordinary death for a man approaching 50 in a cold climate. There is no mystery in the manner of his passing, and it would be dishonest to manufacture one. But there is a small strangeness in what happened to his work. Brenner left an estate that included his camera, his chemicals, his lenses, and what one inventory describes as a large quantity of exposed plates and prints. A working photographer of his standing would have accumulated thousands of negatives over a career. His commissioned work alone, the depots and banks and warehouses, would have filled crates. Yet when his effects were settled, the great mass of his life's work simply disappears from the record. No studio bought his collection, no archive received it, no museum holds it. Of the thousands of plates a man like Brenner must have made, only the 41 in that wooden box are known to survive, and they survive only because a relative by chance kept the box rather than throwing it out with the rest. What happened to the others? Glass plates were valuable. The glass itself could be cleaned and reused. It was common when a photographer died, for his negatives to be scraped clean and sold as plain glass, the images dissolved away forever to recover the cost of the material. Most likely, that is what happened to the bulk of Brenner's life work. An ordinary economic erasure. The images destroyed not by conspiracy, but by thrift. And yet, the 41 that survived are not a random sample. They are overwhelmingly the skyline plates, the rooftop views, the ones with the distant band of structures on the northern horizon, and the tower that appears on no map. If a relative had simply kept a stray handful of a dead man's pictures, we would expect a mix, a portrait here, a storefront there, the ordinary commercial work that made up the body of his trade. Instead, the surviving box is heavy with exactly the images that should not exist, as though someone at some point made a choice about which plates to keep and which to let dissolve, as though the strange ones were the ones worth saving. We cannot know who made that choice, or why. We cannot even be certain it was a choice at all, and not simply the accident of which crate happened to survive a move or a flood or a clearing out of an attic. The honest researcher has to sit with that uncertainty, rather than paper over it. But the result remains, a single box of glass holding a skyline that does not match the history, preserved against every economic incentive to destroy it. Brenner is not entirely alone either, though the corroboration is thin and must be handled with care. A trade journal of the period, in a short notice about photographers working the lakeside cities, mentions in passing a competitor of his who had taken to photographing what the writer called the disused northern structures, and who found no market for the prints because, the notice says, no buyer wished to be reminded of them. The phrasing is casual, almost dismissive, but read against Brenner's 4 words, it lands differently. Disused northern structures. Something stood to the north of that city that working photographers knew well enough to point their cameras at, that the public knew well enough to refuse to buy, and that the formal history would within a generation contain no record of at all. One source is an anomaly. 2 sources, however faint the second, begin to look like a pattern that someone took the trouble to erase. When the plates are studied today by people willing to take them seriously, a few patterns emerge that are worth laying out plainly. The distant structures, when measured against the known buildings in the foreground, whose heights are documented, appear to rise far higher than anything recorded in the city. The tallest verified building in that city in 1881 was a church spire of a known and modest height. The shapes on the northern horizon, by the geometry of the plates, would tower above it by a wide margin. If they were real, they were among the tallest structures in the world at that moment, and not one written word records their existence. The proportions are also strange. The shapes are slender for their height, more slender than the brick and stone construction of the era could safely support, which is exactly why skeptics call them floors or clouds. But it is also exactly what the reset researchers would predict, because their whole argument is that the old works were built by methods and to standards that the official 19th century could not match. A structure too slender for known engineering is either an artifact of bad glass, or it is evidence of an engineering we have forgotten. The plate alone cannot tell us which. It can only tell us that something tall and narrow stood on the northern horizon, held its position across many afternoons, cast a steady shadow, and was called by the man who photographed it the old works. One more pattern is worth stating, because it is the one that survives the harshest scrutiny. When a careful analyst measures the direction of the shadows thrown by the foreground buildings, the verified ones whose orientation is known, and then measures the faint shadow that falls from the tower on the northern horizon, the 2 agree. The sun that lit the church spire is the same sun that lit the tower, arriving from the same quarter of the sky at the same hour. A flaw in the glass has no shadow. A cloud casts no shadow that aligns with the buildings beneath it. Whatever stood on that horizon was lit by the same afternoon light as the rest of the city, which is to say, it was there, on the ground, in the world, and not in the chemistry of the plate or the imagination of the man who held it. There is a temptation, with stories like this, to demand a conclusion, to insist that either the reset is real and the history is a lie, or that Silas Brenner photographed nothing but smoke, and a tired imagination has done the rest. But the plates do not offer a conclusion, and it would be a betrayal of the evidence to pretend they do. What they offer is something rarer and more valuable than an answer. They offer a properly framed question. The question is this. We have inherited a story about the 19th century in which a young, poor, practical society somehow raised the most magnificent buildings in human history, admired them briefly, and then burned or demolished a great many of them, and we have been asked to find nothing strange in any of it. The economics do not balance. The labour does not add up. The speed of the rebuilding after the great fires does not make sense. And here, in a wooden box in the Midwest, is a set of chemical fossils made by a man with no reason to lie, showing a skyline to the north that the official record does not contain, labelled in his own hand as something old and already established. Maybe it is smoke. Maybe it is a flaw in cheap glass. Maybe Silas Brenner, climbing the rooftops in the last summer of his life, was simply a tired tradesman photographing a city that was exactly as ordinary as the books say. That is entirely possible, and an honest mind keeps it firmly on the table. But maybe, when he wrote those 4 words in the margin of a glass plate, he was not creating a mystery. Maybe he was recording something so obvious to him that it needed no explanation, a body of structures to the north that everyone he knew could see, standing in plain sight on ground that would soon be cleared for a fair, and then cleared again, and then built over, and then forgotten, until all that remained was a band of pale shapes on the horizon of 41 plates of glass, and 4 quiet words that have outlasted the world that wrote them. The old works, North. He never explained what he meant. He died before the questions could be asked, and the city he photographed grew over its own northern ground and remembered nothing. But the plates are still there, in the box, in the dark, waiting for someone to hold them up to the light and ask one more time, the only question that matters. What was actually standing on that horizon in the summer of 1881, and who decided that the rest of us should never know its name? That is where the record runs out and the silence begins. What you make of it is yours to decide. Look at the buildings in your own city, the old ones, the ones too grand for the place that supposedly built them, and ask yourself who really laid those stones, and what story you were told to keep from wondering. The answer may be exactly what the books say, or it may be standing in the background of a photograph that someone long ago decided was worth saving from the fire.